I've titled this presentation "Behind Closed Doors" because I think that there's a black box around American university admissions where your children eventually will send in their applications, and then they will wait some amount of time, and then a university or college will send them back a decision, and neither you nor your child will have any clue as to why they got in or did not get in. And I think that adds a lot of stress to the process, unfortunately. It also means sometimes that students aren't doing the right things and that you as parents don't necessarily know how to support them, and it ramps up the level of anxiety. And the truth is, I don't really think we have anything to hide. I feel really proud about what we do at Tufts, and I think most other schools would agree with that, that the way they conduct admissions and the way we make decisions is something to be proud of, not something to be hidden. So the point of this presentation, I think, is to start talking about how we make decisions, to open the door, and to let you have an understanding of what we're doing and why. And so I'm going to start with the first of kind of three components. The first component is I'm going to teach you to think about the admissions process the way an American admissions officer thinks about the admissions process. I'm going to talk about the big components, the large pieces, how they work, how they fit together, and why. And I'm going to do that in this room with you with a particular eye towards why the US process is different from the rest of the world. Just a curiosity, how many of you are American educated? Minority of you? Close to 50%, but not all of you. And even if you, how many of you are, know a lot about the American admissions process as it exists today? Even the people who are American educated don't raise their hands for that. So, if you're familiar with the American process and you're familiar with processes around the rest of the world, you know that the US process is really different. We ask for a set of things no one else asks for. And we ask your children to do a set of things no one else cares about. We ask for extracurricular lists. We're the only system in the world that cares about extracurriculars. We ask for recommendations, most US schools. Most other foreign systems don't care about recommendations. We ask for essays. And even the other systems in the world that ask for essays, in Canada and the UK, use the essays really differently. I mean, even the UK, which asks for a personal statement from students, they have one very specific interest from the essay. How good is your child going to be at the thing they want to study? End of sentence, right? And for the most part, academics are define whether or not you get into the schools you want to go to. In Japan, you take the Japanese university entrance examination. In Korea, you have the Korean Scholastic Aptitude Test. You have the ATAR in Australia, the Arbiter in Germany, the French Bac in France, the A-levels in England, the CAPE in the Caribbean.
He asks questions of the people in front, too.
Right. And whether or not you get into these schools is dependent almost entirely on those academic metrics. End of story. You can draw a hard line in Japan, and you can say, if your Japanese entrance exam is over this, you are in. And if it is under this, you are out, period, no exceptions. The UK makes conditional offers, but below a certain A-level result, done. Everywhere else in the world, whether or not you get into universities is based on that first bullet entirely. Academic achievement. And in the United States, we look at all these other things. And what I want to do is I want to talk to you about why we look at them, why they're important, why they represent merit. Not just that we do it. I mean, I think it's one thing to say we look at an extracurricular list, we want to see that your students are engaged. But that is completely different from explaining to you why we care. And so I want to walk you through that. Then I want to walk you through what an applicant pool looks like at a highly selected university from my perspective. So, you can go on Naviance and you can see what does the applicant pool look like from ISB's perspective. I want you to see what ISB looks like in the whole applicant pool of the 18,000 applications we got this year. And then at the end, we're going to do a brief exercise where I'm going to ask you to vote on candidates, and I'm going to show you how we make decisions. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to start with defining merit in the United States admissions process. And merit is comprised of, I think, of these kind of four large components. There's data, this is academic achievement, this should be pretty self-explanatory. There's talent, what you do outside of class that is of significance. There's voice, this isn't what you do or what you've done, this is who you are. And it's comprised of all these different things: intellectual curiosity, engagement, your background, your nationality, your religion, the language you speak at home, a set of things that defines your worldview, defines how you interact with your culture, with yourself, with ideas. and that is not quantifiable. Like, I can't put a number of years on how tied you are. And then there's institutional priorities. This is the final set of merit. I'm going to talk about this at the end. This is the set of merit that is sexy and gross at the same time. And I don't want to run from it. It matters and it's important, and I'll explain what it is when we get to it. But I'm going to start with data. This is the academics. Academic merit is comprised of these pieces, basically, at every American school. Curricular rigor. This is how hard are the classes you have chosen to take, given what's available to you. If you're at an IB school and you're doing the full IB, that's rigor. Partial IB would be kind of a step down, with IB certificate being closer to the full IB. If you're doing the full IB, you have rigor in the bag. You are done. Rigor is accomplished. And if you don't have full IB, then how much rigor do you have? We look at rigor first, even before we look at the grades, because it's very difficult to determine what the grades mean unless I know how hard the classes have been. This is done using ISB as the context. We are not comparing the grades your children are getting in their classes at ISB to the grades that the children at NIST are getting in the same IB curriculum, because the teachers there grade differently. What it means to get an A at one school is different from what it means to get an A at another. We're not comparing students in the IB to students taking the AP, or doing the French Bac, or students who are in high schools like mine, where they don't have AP or IB, they just have classes. This is all context-based, given what is available here. How much have your children succeeded, given the opportunities available to them in their local environment? Then we look at class rank, if we have it, which we don't here, but that's okay. We look at standardized testing as the kind of final piece to it. Not every school requires standardized testing. But at schools that require it, and Tufts does, the majority of highly selective schools do, it typically falls below 4 years of high school performance in terms of its relevance. Then we look at talent, extracurriculars. What are your students doing? What are your children doing outside of class, and why does it matter? How does it reflect who they are? We're looking at talent, we're looking at leadership, we're looking at long-term interests. We're asking, is this student well-rounded, or do they specialize? And it's not that one of these things is better or worse, but they're different, and they signal different things about the students. Someone whose entire extracurricular list, even if it's a lot of different things, center around the same issues, is different from a student that likes to do a whole bunch of different things in a whole bunch of different places. And there isn't a preference necessarily for which of those we want, but we want to build a community that has some of each. Exploration versus rooted commitments. And this is separate from the question of well-rounded or specialist. You can specialize, all your extracurriculars can be in the same set of things, but you can be doing a lot of different things constantly. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You're trying lots of different things associated with building or robotics. You're involved in lots of different organizations that look at international affairs. And you do a little bit of this, and you get into it, and then you try something else. And that's different from putting your roots down in Model UN and then doing Model UN for 4 years. And they signal different things about different people. I would be an explorer. I like to do lots of different things, I get bored quickly, and I want to move on. And it's not that that's worse than someone who finds something and then sticks with it, but I learn different things than they do. And then there's outstanding to uninvolved. Obviously one of those is better than the other. Outstanding is good. I want to take a moment, though, to explain why this matters, given that it doesn't seem to matter everywhere else in the world. And I want to take kind of a step back, and I want to talk about the economics of education in the United States. You may be aware, as parents, that education in the United States is really expensive. Have you heard? Does this come as a surprise to any of you? Shock. It's really expensive. Much more expensive than everywhere else. Even in the UK, after they trebled the university fees for British students, even after the trebling of the fees, it is still significantly less expensive to go to school in the UK than it is to go to school in the United States. And there's actually a really good set of economic reasons for why. In most of the rest of the world, education is built on traditional principles of efficiency. How do you produce the largest number of graduates possible as quickly as you can, as fast as you can? And in the United States, we turn that on its head. And we operate with an educational principle of what I will describe as deliberate inefficiency. Instead of producing the most number of graduates, as cheaply as you can, as fast as you can. Our goal is to produce the largest number of learning opportunities possible for each of those graduates, which is expensive. Having a school newspaper so that your students studying English or journalism can write for the paper is a valuable educational opportunity, but it does not, strictly speaking, get them closer to a degree. They don't need to work for the school paper to get a degree, and if you're thinking about things in strictly economic terms, why have a school paper if it costs you money? You know, the same thing goes for sports or music on campus, for the whole set of things that students are doing. They're valuable learning opportunities and students grow from them, but they're not getting credit for most of what they're doing outside the classroom. It's not helping them get their degree faster or cheaper. It is making them better when they graduate. And so we want to know these kinds of answers to these kinds of questions because they help us understand how your student will engage with the opportunities on our campus and how they will learn. Not just from the things that take place in the classroom, but the things that take place outside the classroom, because the idea that learning is constant and happens everywhere in our communities, not just in front of a professor, is core to what education in the United States is about at the tertiary level. And then there's voice. These are the things you can't list, right? Like you can put GPA down on a piece of paper, you can write SAT scores on a piece of paper, you can list extracurriculars on a resume. It's really difficult to list things that matter for voice. You know, things like intellectual curiosity. It's very difficult to put a list down where it's like, here's the intellectual curiosity, check plus plus. You know, like these are amorphous ideas that are still really important because there's a big difference between high achieving and curious. Some of your children actually achieve worse in the classroom because they are so curious. They get distracted by the shiny ideas on Wikipedia and spend 4 hours reading about, you know, the Sino-Russian conflict that occurred at the end of the 1800s, instead of writing the paper. And there are students who achieve because they are not curious. They do what has been asked of them, and they don't ask questions. And my goal as an admissions officer isn't just to bring in students who are capable of high academic achievement, but to bring in students who will ask difficult questions of our faculty and push them to be better academics. Our professors don't ask for more students that get A's, they ask for more students who are intellectually engaged. And although grades help you get at some of those pieces, they're not where it ends. Similarly, for civic engagement, for passions, for personal and political philosophy, if you have a community of people debating a political issue and everyone agrees on the same politics, that is a boring debate. You want some students that fall on one side of the argument and some students that fall on the other side of the argument, and grades don't tell us that. But having students with different points of view creates a better learning environment for all of those students. Which is why things like demographics, family background, cultural perspective, socioeconomic, sexual orientation, and language matter. The more diverse our communities, the more opportunity our students have to learn. And voice is where we start to get at some of those things. In some forms of diversity you can really easily check off. You know, what's your passport? What language do you speak at home? What religion are you? I mean, you can list those things. But how those pieces impact your worldview, you can't list. Those are amorphous concepts that are pulled from looking at a whole bunch of qualitative things, like the essay. These are the questions on the Common Application this year. The Common Application questions will change next year, so these aren't directly relevant to your children. But it's useful to see the things that have been asked in the past, and so here they are. My own impression of the Common App is that it is a good starting point, but that these are really boring questions. The questions on next year, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I think the Common App questions next year are better than this year. I think they ask questions with a little more substance, which is nice. But they're still not very interesting questions. And so we tend to get really boring answers to the Common App because when you ask a boring question, you get a boring answer. And that makes it hard to tease out some of the qualities of voice we're looking for. So many schools, Tufts included, have started including supplements. This is common amongst more highly selective schools. Not every school has a supplement, and some extremely well-known, extremely selective, extremely powerful schools don't use them, WashU and Dartmouth being examples. But many schools have supplemental essays that your students will, or your children will be required to write, and that we will evaluate for voice. These are the questions we asked this year on our supplement. The first question is, kind of describe the environment that exists around you and how that environment affects you. And the second question, I think, is kind of the inverse of that. Although it's not explicit, it's saying, describe how you influence the world around you, right? One is about intake of ideas, the other is about output. But to give you an idea of what other schools are asking, here's Yale, Cornell, the University of Chicago, and Duke, the questions on this year's application. You can read them. I actually think you can learn a lot about a school's admissions process by looking at what they ask on their supplements. Cornell's describe your intellectual interests, their evolution, and what makes them exciting to you. This question makes a lot of sense to me, knowing what I know about Cornell's admissions process, because they have professors evaluate their applicants. So if you're a professor, that's what you want to know. I think it's ironic that they're asking about what makes your intellectual interest exciting to you in the most boring way they possibly can. I think it's unfortunate. But it reflects what I understand about Cornell and what they're looking for from their students, which is an articulated academic interest. Maybe that's untrue, maybe if there's a Cornell rep they'd disagree with me, but as an outsider, that's what I see. And then you have Chicago that asks, Othello and Iago, Dorothy and the Wicked Witch, history and art are full of heroes and their enemies. Tell us about the relationship between you and your arch nemesis. And this reflects what I understand to be true about Chicago. It's a place of intellect, a place that really likes ideas, but a place that likes to play with them. And so they ask a question that has an intellectual underpinning, but that is a playful question and that invites their applicants to be playful as well. And I think it's appropriate to read between the lines and to get a sense of what's the attitude of the admissions office and how much latitude do I have to be formal and rigid versus playful and expansive. Institutional priorities, this is the last form of merit that I promised you I would talk about. This is the form of merit that you cannot control. You either are and are not, and often you don't know whether or not you are this form of merit until it's happening. Oh well. One example would be, we built up a large Russian department during the Cold War. We hired all these Russian faculty. The Cold War's over. No one wants to study Russian anymore. And now we have more Russian professors than we have Russian majors, hypothetically. And so the Russian department is sending us all these emails. Bring us more students who want to study Russian. And you apply. And you are really interested in Russian. Or your children apply and are really interested in Russian. You are not applying anywhere. Maybe you don't have the same academics as someone else. They're good, but they're not as good as someone else. But you represent for us an important form of institutional merit. The ability to keep our Russian faculty happy. Now, let's say we are successful and we actually recruit an additional 5 Russian majors. We've doubled the number of Russian majors, and now there are 6 Russian professors and 10 Russian majors. And the Russian professors are like, oh my god, we didn't really want to do more work. We don't need more students. Thanks for sending us these 10. We're done, please. Now you apply and you're a Russian major in the next year. It's not that it hurts you to be a Russian major, but it stops helping. 1 year being a Russian major is your ticket in, provided you have strong enough academics. The next year, being a Russian major has nothing to do with your decision. The same would be true about our football team. This one is not hypothetical. Let's say our football team has lost every game for the last 2 seasons, and somehow your child is miraculously the best football prospect our coach had ever seen, despite living and being Thai. I don't know why. Your son has an arm that's like this big across, but great, and our coach is super interested in the first Thai quarterback ever to play for a U.S. football team. And you apply, we're going to take you, provided you can do the work academically. Right? If you're in the ballpark and I think you can come and be successful, we're going to admit you, because our football team has lost its last 18 consecutive games. And our alums are really upset. Now, the next year you apply and you're a quarterback, but we just found our quarterback. It's not that being a quarterback hurts you. It's not like, whoa, we can't have 2 quarterbacks. But being a quarterback stops helping you because you're not going to be our quarterback. Similar things would be true for, if your family has a long history of financial contributions to my institution, and your family's financial contributions are responsible for me being able to fund Thai students who cannot afford our tuition to be able to come to our school, provided your son or daughter is in the ballpark academically, we're going to take them. And I have no problem with that. The ability for my school to further the academic mission of providing a diverse community of people where socioeconomic diversity is represented is only possible because of the generosity of our alums. And if your family helps us meet that institutional priority, your child has merit. Now, the vast majority of our applicants, 99.9999% of our applicants, that might have been 19 too many, but whatever, don't have that as a factor for why they get in. You don't need that to get into our schools. Most people don't. But you're either going to have it or you're not. And if you're looking at a Navient scattergram and you're wondering, why did that kid get in and that one didn't? It's possible that maybe the admissions officer who read that application just loved the student with the lower academics that much more. But it's also possible that something like this was at work. You know, they happened to apply for the right major and didn't know it. They happened to play the oboe. We needed an oboe player that year. You don't know it, we know it. It makes sense to us, it doesn't make sense to you. What I want to do now is I want to walk you through the context of a highly selective admissions pool. I want to show you what it looks like. To do that, I'm going to start with the kinds of schools I'm talking about when I describe highly selective. This is not, obviously, a full list of the schools that count as being highly selective, but it's a good place to kind of start for thinking. These are some schools that you've heard of. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of schools that are highly selective in the United States that won't be here, but that's okay. NYU, Cornell, Northwestern, Penn, Tufts, Rice, Duke, Stanford, Yale. What I think is really interesting about this list is how little differentiation there is. Does that surprise you? That all these schools have essentially identical students enrolling at their institutions by SAT scores? It actually surprised me when I pulled this up. I don't know if I was expecting so much homogeneity. And what I want you to see from this is both how what I'm talking about at Tufts, like what other schools is this relevant, but also how deep the American system of higher education is in terms of quality. In significant parts of the rest of the world, there is a huge difference in quality between the number 1 ranked school and the number 5 ranked school in that country. It's the case here in Thailand. There's a really big difference between the best school and the 5th best school. And there's an even bigger difference between the 5th best school and the 10th best school. And a huge difference between the 10th best school and the 20 best school. I don't actually think there's a 20 best school in Thailand, but like, let's go to China, right? And the 20 best school in China, very different from the 20 best school, or very different from the 10th. Which would be the same in Korea, it's the same in Germany, it's the same in the UK, it's the same in Korea. You know, you have these systems where there's a huge gap between the schools ranked at the top and the schools ranked just a few spaces down. This is not the case in the United States. There is virtually identical quality of education for essentially the first 50 schools. And even comparing the number 50 ranked school to the number 100 ranked school, the difference in quality is not that big. And so I share this with you to open you up, but also to point out that some of what you're used to understanding about education because of your own backgrounds or the background you live in now may not apply to the American system, and you should be really critical about the idea that your child has to go to a top 10 or top 20 ranked school to get a good education in the United States, because you can quantifiably demonstrate that's not true. The scale, so just really briefly, when I talked about academics before, essentially every student that we review is academically rated. This is the case at every American school. Every school has their own rating system. At Tufts it's 1 to 7. 1 is the best, 7 is the worst. There are schools where 7 is the best, 1 is the worst. There are 10-point scales and 20-point scales and so on and so forth. But all of the scales that schools use essentially boil down to 4 broad academic categories. Students that are outstanding, students that represent stronger than a typical admit academically, students that are competitive, students that look like an average admit academically, students that are viable, students who you know can do the work, who you could admit, but who are weaker than what you usually admit, and students who need context. These are students where, without additional information, we come away from that application thinking that that particular student is not academically equipped to succeed at my school. Graphically, this is what that looks like. This is not Tufts, this is not ISB. But to give you a sense, the outstanding students are the ones that almost always get in, because they're better than a normal admit. The competitive students are the ones that sometimes get in, because they're what a normal admit looks like. And at highly selective schools, this is where they do the bulk of their admission, but it's also where they do the bulk of their denying. And then there's the viable students, where if a viable student applies to Tufts, so what we would call viable, you would describe as a reach. Right? So your kid applies to a reach school, that kid is going to be viable in our context. And the viable students sometimes get in, but look at that. You really should not assume they're going to get in. I actually think it's safer and healthier to assume your children will not get into their reach schools. If they do get in, that is a cause worthy of celebration. And that does not mean you should discourage them from applying to those schools. It doesn't mean that they and you shouldn't reach and be ambitious, but you should assume they will not get into a reach school, because what it means that it is a reach school is statistically they will not get in. And you need to be realistic. Hopeful, but realistic. And the truth is that both of these viable kids who got in were probably institutional priorities. They probably represented some need that the institution had that made them go down and take kids at a zone where they usually don't. Not always. There were students in my applicant pool this year that I read who their applications were just so brilliant, and they didn't have good SAT scores, but who cared, because they were clearly very smart. And we took them even though they fell in the viable band for no other reason than because they were just so smart in their applications. But it's really difficult to make the argument in an application that you're smarter than your numbers. You can do it, and it's possible, and your children can be successful making that argument, but it's challenging to do it, and it's rare when it succeeds. This is the slide I'm probably not, strictly speaking, supposed to show you. I'm going to show you the admit rates for those categories. So, first, the outstanding group, which represented 12% of our applicant pool. To give you a sense of what you need to be academically outstanding at Tufts, you need a 2350 or better, and essentially straight A's. Maybe 5 kids at ISB every year are capable of falling into this group. Maybe more, but not many more. The competitive group is much, much larger. And many more students at ISB are capable of falling into it. And this represents about half of our applicant pool. The viable group represents a little bit less than a third. And the group that needs context, the group that I can throw out based on nothing but academics, is less than 10%. And this is pretty normal. If you asked highly selective schools to kind of array themselves like this, A, they wouldn't, but B, they do in secret, they just won't show you. But if they did and you got to see it, this is essentially what it looks like. In schools that are slightly less selective, you'll see more kids creep from the competitive group into the outstanding group, right? And at Harvard, for instance, literally no one is in the outstanding group. That outstanding group is 0% at schools like that. And the viable group would be much, much larger. But this represents what is essentially typical. And the admit rates for these categories, for the top kids, our admit rate was 57%. And the lowest viable rating had an admit rate of just 3%. So there's clearly a direct link between how strong your academics are and whether or not you get in. Though I will point out that although 57% seems high, think about what it means to fall into the outstanding group. It means that 4 out of every 10 students who have essentially perfect grades and essentially perfect SAT scores are getting denied. Some of you just made a face like, what? I actually saw that, you look really confused. So that's where this next part comes in. This is where I demonstrate to you why. So what we're going to do, and we're going to try to move pretty quickly, is I'm going to show you 6 applicants in 3 rounds. In the first round, I'm going to show you their academics, and I'm going to ask you to vote for 2 candidates. You're going to pick the 2 you like the most based on just the numbers. All you're going to have are the numbers. You're not going to know anything about them, or what they want to do, or where they're from, or what language they speak at home. You're not going to know anything about them at all except the numbers. So for those of you who are really curious about what SAT scores your children need to get into blank university, this is the round for you. In round 2, I'm going to show you their extracurriculars, the things they do outside of class. And I'm going to ask you to combine the extracurriculars with the academic information. And based on those 2 pieces together, I'm going to ask you to vote again for 2. Then we're going to do everything else. I'm going to show you what they want to study, where they're from, what they wrote about in their essays, what their teachers said in their recommendations, all the stuff that would count for voice. And based on the 3 pieces together, you add it all up, you're going to vote again for 2.
So you need a little piece of paper, if you have it.
Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Sounds interesting, right? And what I'm going to present to you is slightly simplified. Mostly the academics actually have been simplified. But the rest of what I'm going to present to you is going to be presented to you essentially in the same way these applicants were presented in committee when admissions officers were voting to admit them or not to admit them. So I'm not going to show you their essays, I'm not going to show you their recommendations. Instead, what I'm going to show you is what an admissions officer said about their essays and their recommendations. Because when you're trying to make a decision on an applicant pool of 18,000, you don't have time for a room of 6 admissions officers to open up and read together every essay. So you have to rely on the person who originally read the application to tell you what it said so that you can vote. And what you're going to see is that piece. You're going to see what I see when I have to vote yes or no on someone else's applicant. So this is as authentic as I can possibly make it without overwhelming you. So first is the data. To remind you what data is, it's grades and marks and SAT scores. For simplicity's sake, all 6 of the applicants you're going to see fall into that broad competitive category. And they all have similar levels of rigor. I've recalculated their GPAs to be on a 4-point scale. We don't actually do this at Tufts. We use whatever GPA the school gives us. But that won't make any sense to you here because you don't know the schools that these kids are coming from. And even if you did know them, you wouldn't know their GPA scales. So I've evened it out as much as possible so that you're on a level playing field, these kids, and you're going to be able to vote for 2. And here are the 6. Connor, Jillian, Hannah, Ethan, Julie, and Sharon. So GPA is out of 4. If you're unfamiliar with the 4-point scale, a 4.0 would be basically a perfect A record. A 3.0 would be basically straight Bs. A 3.5 is half A's, half B's. A 3.6 would be mostly an average to an A minus. A 3.33 would average to a B plus. The first score is the critical reading score of the SATs. The second score is the math. The third score is the writing. And then there's a subject test. We require 2, but again, to keep it easier for you, it's 1 SAT subject test that I've put up here. Lit, bio, US history, physics, Spanish, and US history. So I'm going to give you 25 seconds, and I'm going to ask you to vote for 2. And counselors, if you want to vote, that's
I'm not going to vote, I was going to take numbers.
Okay. Voting is good too. I don't mind if you vote. It's sometimes helpful. The counselors point stuff out. Parents aren't thinking about it yet. There's an app I have on my phone that lets me play a game that lasts exactly 94 seconds. And I'm like halfway tempted to play it while you're doing this. And then at the end of it, be like, okay, and now we're all ready. I'm not going to. You ready? Mm-hmm. You ready? Okay. So for round 1, for the academic round, how many of you are voting for Connor? 0 of you. How helpful.
Poor Connor.
Poor Connor. How many of you are voting for Jillian? Don't look to see if other people are voting with you. Vote on your own. Jillian. So that's 6. For Hannah? 2, 3. For Ethan? So most of you. And for Sharon? Oh, Julie, sorry. For Julie? 1, 2, 3. And for Sharon? So Sharon has 10. At least that's what I counted. So the winners after round 1 are Ethan and Sharon. Sharon by nose, just a little bit over Julie. So I didn't tell you this, but in committee when we're making decisions, there's a lot of arguing. People say who they're going to vote for, and then they make the case to see if they can persuade other people, especially in a case like this. So Julie was 1 vote shy. I'd like to invite any of you who voted for Julie who want to make a case for why other people should join you to make the case.
I would, because her Spanish is 770. To me, that seems quite high. Also, her critical reading is 780, which is really, it's significantly insignificant between 780 and 790. So that's why.
So the bilingualism,
Yeah.
that's exciting for you. Anybody else? You have to do this. Like, there's no quiet in committee.
All right, okay, so I have a question in committee then. Are we looking at the writing now? It's just like the other ones these days.
I mean, it is. I mean, we're looking at it, but you know, if you're trying to build a community of students who aren't just good at humanities and verbal things, but also a community of students who are good at quantitative things, and you give the writing and the critical reading 2/3 of the weight of the SATs, then you will literally admit no kids who are good at math. So, you know, I mean, it's there, and we're looking at it, but it's not, I mean, you think of the testing in terms of adding it up to 3 sections. Like, what's the number at the end of those 3 sections? A 2340 is obviously better than a 2320. I don't know if I make the same argument. I mean, I can see an instance where a student has an 800 math and a 720, you know, critical reading and a 720 writing, and that student is in fact stronger for us than a student that has, you know, a 760, you know, reading, 760 writing, and a 580 math, right? Where like the numbers even out in a different kind of way. Does anyone who voted for Sharon want to defend Sharon against Kathy? Yeah.
Well, I'd say that Sharon's SAT scores are more well-rounded. So, although about equal on the SAT, the critical reading, the other ones are better rounded. The grade differential, yeah, there's a differential there, but that can be due to a number of things. I think they're statistically close enough.
Yeah, and they're both A students.
So, and I'd say the same thing about Ethan. So, although it's lower on the math, he's got 740 on his SAT 2 in physics.
Yeah. That's part of the reason why the subject testing ends up mattering a lot, is because sometimes you see students that, like, you know, a 670 on math, but he did really well in the physics, and you can't do that well in the physics if you can't do math. So, so we're going to move on to round 2 now.